All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the New York Fed's fifth Economic Inequality Policy Forum, focused on the impact of inflation. It is an absolute pleasure to welcome you, to hear from you, and to share our economists' great work with you today. The Economic Inequality Policy Series is part of a broader effort to understand the economy and how communities across our region and the nation experience it, all in pursuit of fostering a healthy and inclusive economy that optimizes our full economic potential. Today, we will be looking at the impacts the 2021 to 2022 rise in inflation has had on communities of color. Of course, high inflation impacts all segments of our society, which is why we are singularly committed to addressing it. It obviously makes it more expensive to feed our families, heat our homes, and pay for housing. While everyone feels the pain, not everyone is affected equally. Often, those who can least afford the essentials, food, gas, housing, see greater impacts in their households from the effects of inflation. Inflation also has a disparate impact across ethnic and demographic groups. Notably, and relevant to today's discussion, economists at the New York Fed found that since 2021, Black and Hispanic households have faced higher inflation than the national average, and Hispanic families have been affected the most. This is largely because, on average, Hispanic households spend a larger share of their budgets on items most affected by the recent high inflation. Today, we will also hear from leaders who are engaged in critical work in their communities and who will offer some insights on how families are coping with and weathering this high inflation. There's much work to be done to ensure that we are fostering an equitable recovery and ensuring that everyone can fulfill their economic potential. That's why at the New York Fed, we strive to better understand what contributes to economic inequities and potential steps forward, to foster equitable growth. I thank you all for tuning in, and I look forward to hearing from all of the experts here today. And I want to especially thank our panelists for joining us. So, with that, I will turn it over to Devon Brody. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everyone. My name is Devon Bodie. I work here at the New York Fed on the community development team. I just wanted to note that this event is being recorded. The recording will be available on the New York Fed's website after the event for public viewing. Next, I would like to introduce Raji Chakrabarty, who is the head of Equitable Growth Studies at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. She will be giving a presentation that explores our key question of the morning: was the 2021-22 rise in inflation equitable? There will be a question and answer session at the end of Raji's presentation. So please submit your questions throughout the presentation in the question and answer box. You can find the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. With that, Raji, I invite you to turn on your camera and start the presentation.
Thank you, Devon. Today, I'm going to talk about inflation disparities across demographic groups. And this is joint work with Maxim Pinkowski here in the research group as well. So what we are going to look at today is explore differences across race and ethnicity, income, age, and geography of inflationary experiences during the 2021-22 inflationary episode. So let's jump right in. We will start with a set of motivating questions. Large inflationary pressures in 21-22 are very well established in aggregate national data, and I'm sure you have seen those. While inflation has eased a little, mostly because of the drop in fuel prices, inflation still remains high. So the question is, were there differences in inflationary pressures across demographic groups? And even more, a harder question, an important question is, how do we compare inflation across demographic groups? It is not straightforward, as data on inflationary pressures by demographic groups are not really produced directly. So in the next slide, we are going to actually lay out the process or the method that we use. Actually, before that, we'll recap our findings and then go on to the method. What we find is that inflation gaps widened considerably during the 2021 inflationary episode. The groups that experienced higher inflation were middle income earners, young people, people with a college degree, people residing in South and Midwest, and Black and Hispanic Americans. Now, what is the method that we use to understand differences in inflationary pressures? So basically, we use two different pieces of available data to actually conduct this analysis of differences in demographic pressures. First, we use national measures of inflation for various goods and services. And that's a key measure, and that is actually available in our data. For example, transportation prices, specifically used car prices and fuel prices, have risen really fast, whereas inflation and in the entertainment and education sectors have remained very low, or comparatively low, I should say. So there is a really big difference. There are big differences across inflationary pressures across different categories, and then we are going to leverage that in our analysis. The second piece constitutes shares of expenditures in these goods and service categories across demographic groups. As you will soon see, there actually are quite big differences in these shares of expenditures in various goods and service categories across different demographic groups. So the fundamental intuition that we employ here is that if the consumption basket of a demographic group has higher share of certain categories that also face higher inflationary pressures, then this specific demographic group will also face higher inflationary pressure. To illustrate our method, we will next show you these two components that we leverage in the next two slides. So in this slide, you can see that we are depicting inflationary pressures and inflationary trends in three categories, three key categories, I should say. We have chosen these three categories because they constitute the highest shares in the overall consumption basket. They together constitute 2/3 of the overall consumption basket. So changes in prices in these categories will have substantive effects on inflation faced by demographic groups. While the dashed black line shows the overall headline 12-month inflation that you are familiar with, we can see that there is considerable variation in inflationary trends across the categories that we are depicting. Specifically, you can see that transportation prices have risen particularly sharply in 2021. So demographic groups that have higher shares of their consumption basket going to transportation will face higher inflationary prices. Also, I should say that throughout the presentation, the gray bar will represent the COVID recession. Now, in this slide, we depict the second piece of data that we use to construct the demographic inflation rates. Here we are presenting the share of expenditures in the three categories that you saw in the earlier slide: food, housing, and transportation for Asians, Blacks, Hispanics, and whites. Starting from this slide and moving forward, we will depict the lines and bars for Asian Americans by yellow, Black Americans by green, and Hispanic Americans by orange, and white Americans, our overall population, we will be presenting by the same color, which is blue. Basically what we see here is that in the very left-hand side, you see the demographic variation in demographic groups in food consumption. The middle panel, we depict housing, and the right panel is for transportation. We find that there is variation in the composition of consumption baskets across these groups. Black and Hispanic Americans have higher share of transportation compared to the other groups that you see in this slide. Specifically, Hispanic Americans have the highest share of transportation. Black and Asian Americans have higher share of housing compared to the other racial and ethnic groups that you see in this slide. So for each demographic group, we combine the shares of expenditures in goods and services, for example, that you see in this slide, with corresponding inflation measures that you saw in the previous slide to obtain inflationary trends of the specific demographic groups. In other words, we compute weighted averages of goods and services with weights being these demographic expenditure shares to obtain measures of inflation by demographic groups. So how do we estimate the demographic inflation gaps? Let's consider the two charts in this page, in this slide. First, consider the left-hand side chart. Using the method I just outlined, we obtain the overall inflation line depicted in the left-hand side chart by the blue line. Here, as an example, we are also presenting the inflation line for one demographic group, Hispanic Americans, in orange. The gap between the blue and the orange line at any point reflects the inflation gap of Hispanic Americans in that month relative to the overall average. For example, in the left-hand side chart, we show that the inflation gap for Hispanic Americans in June of 2021 was 0.75 percentage point, or 3/4 of a percentage point. We then plot this inflation gap of 3/4 of a percentage point in the right-hand side chart for June. We repeat for each month between January of 2019 and September of 2022 to get the inflation gap for Hispanic Americans during this period, which is depicted here is in the orange chart, the right-hand side chart. In this chart, we reproduce the inflation gap once again for Hispanic Americans in orange. We also depict the inflation gap for Black Americans relative to the overall average, similarly calculated in green. Similarly, we also depict the inflation line, the relative inflation line of Asian Americans in yellow. Moving chronologically from the left-hand side to the right-hand side of the chart, we find that in the pre-COVID period, there was only a very small inflation gap with Black and Hispanic Americans actually facing slightly lower inflationary pressures than the overall average. As the COVID recession struck, you can see the Black and Hispanic Americans actually faced even lower inflation rates, while Asians actually faced higher inflation rates. This pattern completely reversed from early 2021, specifically March of 2021, when Black and Hispanic Americans faced markedly higher inflation relative to the overall average, with inflation gaps widening substantially. After June of 2022, as inflation eased, mostly driven by fuel prices, you actually see that Hispanic Americans actually also saw a downtown inflation. And the inflation gaps between the Hispanic Americans and the overall average actually declined. And you see that there has been a slight contraction of the inflationary gaps over time after June 2022 as fuel prices have started to drop. Yet it is still the case that Hispanic Americans do face higher inflation pressures compared to other racial and ethnic groups. So most of this is really driven by the differences in the consumption basket, specifically the share going to transportation. So in the next slide, we dig deeper to try to understand what specific components in transportation are making this difference. On the left-hand side, you see 5 bars corresponding to white Americans, Black Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Asian Americans, where we split the transportation share that you saw in the earlier slides into the specific component shares of transportation. What you can see in this slide is that if you focus on the blue, which actually depicts the share of fuel in the consumption baskets of these various demographic groups or various racial ethnic groups, you actually see the Hispanics Americans actually had the highest share of fuel consumed compared to the other racial and ethnic groups. Same is the case for used cars. So for both used cars as well as for fuel, Hispanics actually had higher shares in their consumption baskets compared to other racial ethnic groups. And on the other hand, on the right-hand side, what you see is that if you actually look at the component prices within transportation, fuel and used cars were the ones that actually faced the highest inflationary trends. Fuel by far was the highest in terms of inflationary patterns that we saw starting from March of 2021. And interestingly, when fuel prices started to drop, which was in June of 2022, we also started to see that the gaps between racial ethnic categories started to drop, started to converge, and Hispanic Americans started to face slightly lower inflation rates than before. Now, moving on to other heterogeneity in demographic groups, here we are depicting heterogeneity of inflation pressures by household income. On the left-hand side, we are showing you share of expenses in these three categories: food, housing, and transportation. If you focus the third set of bars, which relate to transportation, you can clearly see that the third and fourth quintiles, which is our second group of the income distribution, actually have highest share of transportation in their consumption basket compared to either the first or second quintile, which is our first group, or the fifth quintile, which is our highest group or the third group. Similarly, now if you focus on the right-hand side chart, which is basically depicting the differences in inflationary trends across these three groups, with gray depicting the inflationary trend of the first and second quartile, actually I should say black depicting the first and second quintile, light gray depicting the fifth quintile, and orange depicting the third or fourth quintile. What you can actually clearly see here is that, again, from March of 2021, when fuel prices soared, the demographic differences, income differences started widening, with the third and fourth quintiles of the income distribution facing considerably higher inflationary pressures than the other groups. Once again, in June of 2022, when fuel prices started to drop, what you also see is that there is a convergence between inflationary pressures of these various groups. Next, we distinguish by age. On the left-hand side, we are showing you share of expenses of the same three categories: food, housing, and transportation, by these three different age groups that you see here. The bars for under 25 really represent the consumption shares in these three categories: food, housing, and transportation, for young people who are aged under 25. The blue bar corresponds to the shares of the middle age, 25 to 54, and over 54 is depicted by the yellow bars. Once again, on the left-hand side, what you see is that the younger people, under 25 people, actually have highest share of transportation among these groups in their consumption basket. And this is followed by the 25 to 54 group, and then finally the over 54 group. On the right-hand side chart, you actually see the reflection of this. You see that under 25 people and 25 to 54 people actually face considerably higher inflationary pressures than the over 54 people. And the highest inflationary pressures were faced by the younger population under 25. Once again, that coincides with the differences in transportation share that you see on the left-hand side. The increases correspond to, again, the same March of 2021 when the gap started widening and the gap started shrinking from June of 2022 when fuel prices started to fall. Next, we look at differences by education categories of households. We depict college and no college respectively by red and blue. Once again, on the left-hand side, we are presenting the consumption shares in these three categories of the two groups, college and no college people. If you focus again on the third set of bars that relates to transportation, you see that no college people actually have higher shares of their consumption basket going to transportation compared to people who have college degrees. On the right-hand side, we are depicting the demographic inflation rates relative to average for these two education groups. Once again, we find that when fuel prices started to soar, the gaps across these two categories started widening when you measured inflationary pressures. And the gaps remained very large until once again in June 2022, when fuel prices started to drop and the gaps started to shrink. Finally, we also look at inflationary pressures by region. We are looking at census regions, the four census regions, Northeast, Midwest, South, and West. Northeast is represented by red, Midwest by green, South by yellow, and green is West. On the left-hand side, once again, we are presenting consumption shares in these three categories, food, housing, and transportation. If you focus on the last set or the third set of bars, you see that transportation shares were considerably higher in Midwest and South. On the right-hand side chart, we are depicting the inflation rates across these geographic regions relative to average. And what you see here, once again, is that the inflationary patterns started to widen in March of 2021 as fuel prices rose, and the highest inflationary pressures were faced by residents of two areas, Midwest and South. Once again, after June 2022, as fuel prices started to drop, you see a shrinkage of the gaps, and basically the gaps between currently at the very last point of our data is September of 2022, and at that point there essentially is not a difference between Midwest and West. So basically, I should say that demographic graphs that we have depicted so far are mostly driven by transportation differences in their consumption basket and fuel prices, used car prices showing really large hikes in early 2021. Now, to conclude, what we have done here is that we have combined group varying spending shares and inflation patterns across goods and services to construct demographic inflation patterns across different demographic groups. Our main conclusion is that inflation inequality has increased during the inflationary episode by much more than was seen before the pandemic. However, as fuel prices started to drop, inflation inequality is now declining. Groups with relatively high transportation shares, such as Hispanic Americans, the young, the middle-aged people, the less educated, and people residing in South and West actually faced above average inflation. So I'll stop there and open up for any questions.
Thank you, Raji. We do have a few questions from the audience. I will select about two or three. The first question is from Maria Quagliana. and that is it harder to get data about Native Americans? If so, why is that? And I just want to add a secondary question to that. Are immigrant or non-citizen consumers included in these estimates?
So yes. So I'll take the second one first. Immigrants are included and non-citizens as well are included, but they are included in these various groups as they might belong. In terms of the first question, Native Americans are actually a very small share of the population, and the data can be actually very noisy. And that's the reason we are not depicting them here, and we have depicted the other categories. And I should also say that much of this, so we would actually like to break it up, for example, by other groups or other demographic groups, but we are very limited by the data. So that's the reason we are actually looking at the various demographic cuts that you see in the data here.
Thanks, Raji. Our next question is from Barbara Van Kerkhove, and it was in regards to slide 11. And they say, noticing that the fifth income quartile was always under the average inflationary pressures. Can you explain that at all?
So this slide that you were talking about, and you are basically saying that the fifth quintile, as you see here, is always below average. And that also relates to the consumption share that you see here. So if you can see here that they have actually have a lower share of transportation spending, as well as a lower share of housing and food. These are the three categories, as we depicted before, that actually faced higher inflationary pressures. And that's the reason, because these actually constitute lower shares of their consumption basket. They also face lower inflationary pressures on average than the overall average, I should say. So it really has to do with their consumption shares of the different categories.
Our next question is from Ken Brown, and it's about transportation. So this question is, are higher transportation costs positively related to rural residency versus living in a city?
I think this is an excellent question. So the reason, and as you can see here throughout consistently, there is quite a bit of heterogeneity in terms of transportation shares across these different demographic groups. And most of these differences in inflationary pressures are contributed by differences in shares of transportation, because transportation prices went up really rapidly starting from 2021 and still continues to be very high. And this is very much related, as you actually indicate, to places where they reside. These groups are more likely to reside in rural places where public transportation is much less prominent, and they have to use cars. Oftentimes they buy used cars, which actually faced large price hikes during this period. And they actually need to buy fuel, which again faced very high prices during this period. So this can be largely attributed to the places that they reside. Another factor is that they might also live, for example, even if they are working in New York City, they might actually be traveling a lot to come to their place of work. So a lot of New York City has great public transportation, but it is quite possible that they're actually living in areas where they have to take the car first to a subway stop and then take the subway. So as a result of that, they will be utilizing cars and they will be utilizing fuel. So it really has to do with where you reside and how far, even in areas, in like urban areas like New York City, even though there is public transportation, which is not very costly, you actually reside far away from public transportation. So you actually have to get, some fuel as well as used cars, which actually faced very, very high price inflation during this period.
And we'll take one more question, and this one is about housing from Zalika Johnson. And it is, when you say housing, are we looking into home ownership or rental housing?
It's actually both are included. So it is the total housing share that we are looking at here. So both included here.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Raji, for that really informative presentation. And I think that really sets the stage for the next panel that we'll be hearing from. So we can go ahead and move on to the next session. I will say that this deck will be shared after the event, so you will be able to access it. Next, I am excited to introduce our panel on inflation impacts in communities of color and policy insights. Unfortunately, there will be no question and answer after this panel. With us today are four community leaders who I will introduce now, and I invite them to turn on their cameras as I introduce. So first, we will be joined by Dietrich Asante Muhammad, who is the Chief of Organizing Policy and Equity at the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. Next, we'll be joined by Cassandra Martinchek, who is a research associate at the Urban Institute. Next, we'll be joined by Jose Quinones, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Mission Asset Fund. And lastly, but not least, we'll be joined by Jennifer Sun, who is Executive Vice President in the Planning Division at the New York City Economic Development Corporation. Hi, everyone. So before I begin the panel and before we begin our discussion, we will have a very brief presentation from Cassandra on how communities are feeling the impacts of inflation. So Cassandra, I will pass it over to you to begin that presentation.
Wonderful. Good morning, everyone. So as we heard during the initial presentation, measures of inflation have shown sustained pressure on families' essential costs in 2022, including housing, gas, and food. So today I'll share some recent research from the Urban Institute on how this sustained pressure impacts families' financial and food security. So I'll do this by focusing on two indicators of financial resilience: food insecurity and debt and collections. So food insecurity is a symptom of financial uncertainty as families trade off between food and other expenses in ways where they don't have sufficient resources remaining to purchase enough food to live an active and healthy life. This negatively, so debt and collections is another indicator of financial distress where families struggle to repay debts. And this negatively impacts their credit health, which can constrain their access to low-cost credit in emergencies, as well as employment opportunities. Together, these two indicators help us understand disparities in financial resilience, or if families have the economic, social, and institutional resources to buffer against a shock and remain financially secure. So, higher food prices, like what we have been seeing over the past year, push up local food insecurity rates. And prior research indicates that food price increases are associated with a 2.7 percentage point increase in household food insecurity. So the Urban Institute has examined food insecurity rates among adults 18 to 64 at 3 points in time since 2020. The first was in early 2020 as the economy shut down during the early days of the pandemic, which is indicated by the blue bar in this graphic. The second was in mid-2021, where there was a robust policy response to pandemic-related economic hardship, and this is represented by the yellow bar. And the third was this past summer amidst high inflation and diminishing supports for families, and that's the black bar. And so these changing policy contexts are really important to consider because families' access to public benefits and supports can help them buffer against economic shocks and become more financially resilient. And when we look over time with these graphs, we see there's an uptick in food insecurity among all households in 2022, but disproportionately higher rates among Black and Latinx families, with nearly 1 in 3 families of color reporting they were food insecure this past month. These gaps in food security status between white and Black and Latinx households predates the pandemic and reflects a history of structural disinvestment and exclusion of communities of color in wealth creation and financial stability opportunities. The disproportionately high rates of food insecurity among families of color is especially concerning because of the possible negative long-term health implications of food insecurity. However, inflation does not just impact food prices, and for families whose income mostly goes to necessities like housing, food, utilities, and gas, they have less flexibility to shift spending. So surges in gas and transportation costs, indicated by the blue and yellow lines here, over the past year have outpaced wage growth, shown by the black line, which shrinks the financial resources families have to meet their other needs. While inflation has slowed recently due to less upward pressure from gas prices, the overall price level that income-constrained families face at the grocery store and to meet their other essential needs is higher than it was last year. And to meet their financial and food needs, families often turn to credit, loans, borrowing from friends and family, selling assets, or using high-cost loans. So given high inflation across multiple essential goods, families may turn to credit and loans to close the gap between their income and expenses, especially if they have limited or fixed incomes. So before the inflationary period, credit health was improving across all communities, which we see here by the slight decline in the line graph. But racial gaps in credit health persisted. So in majority Black and majority Native American communities, which are represented by the pink and black lines, the share of residents with debt and collections remained more than twice as high in October 2020 than for residents living in majority white communities, as indicated by the yellow line. There is potential that inflationary pressures and increased costs of borrowing may result in consumers of color falling behind on repayment or turning to high-cost lenders, resulting in worsening credit outcomes in the coming months that constrain families' access to credit and other resources. So inflation is just one factor that influences families' financial resilience, and as supports that buffer price increases that help families cope with rising prices have constrained, families may have fewer benefits available to cope with rising prices for food and other basic needs. So when we talk to families, we hear how they cope with higher prices by reducing the nutritional quality of the food they eat, reducing their food intake overall, and opting for lower cost alternatives. Two mothers in Texas who are participating in a USDA meals program describe how inflation increased the pressure on their budget. So they said, "We're struggling more this year because of the rise of cost of everything, more so than when the pandemic hit. The prices of gas and food is ridiculous." As these pressures grow, families struggle to cope with increases in costs. We're definitely cutting back a lot. We were at the beginning, it was a little hard. Then things got easier, and now with everything being so expensive, we're going to have to try a little harder. Overall, inflation is increasing communities of color risk of experiencing food insecurity and undermining their financial resilience. Without sustained support and intentional policies that address racial barriers, the economic impacts of inflation could create major setbacks on the pathway to an inclusive recovery and for families of color financial resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassandra. So let's get started with our panel discussion. I think that was such a powerful quote that we see on the screen right now, just about how families are actually dealing with the price increases and inflation increases. And I think I want to begin with a roundtable. I want to ask each of you, and I really want to explore, how are households and communities that you're serving, how are they coping with higher prices of all the essential items, food, housing, transportation? And on top of that, what are the most important concerns for people in your communities right now? I'll start with you, Dietrich. How has inflation impacted communities of color?
Yeah, well, I think, we've heard a lot of great data of breaking down how it's affected communities of color in particular. I think I've seen in my family, people looking at the food cost. And, I think one thing, particularly the African American and Latino community and Native American community, is that as we've seen, this kind of deep racial wealth divide, economic insecurity has been pretty constant amongst all this change of COVID recession, pulling out of the COVID recession. That's been consistent. So this economic insecurity, I think many communities, have always figured out tricks in order to get by during challenging times. I know some people are saying I'm going vegetarian right now because meat costs so much. I think what's really people are glad to see is that the kind of cost of gas and maybe it's more possible to get a used car, though still quite challenging. So I think there's many different concerns that people have been dealing with. But I think one of the great challenges is whether we're dealing with great inflation or little inflation. When are we going to break this great racial economic inequality and deep economic insecurity in communities of color?
That's a great point. And Jose, let me turn it over to you. What impacts are you seeing in Latinx and immigrant communities?
Well, one, thank you for inviting me to this important conversation, and also want to say that that was an incredible analysis. So I commend the researchers for putting that together. I cannot tell you enough that I've been in so many meetings, dealing with so many researchers dealing with national data, and we're always asking for the racial analysis, the racial angle to it, and that they never do it. So it's it's wonderful to kind of see it actually happening. So I again thank you for doing that background. At the Mission Asset Fund, what we work with low income immigrant communities across the country, and we've seen all this in real time. I mean, during the pandemic, we saw, we were actively helping people that were excluded from receiving federal assistance. So we were actually looking at, trying to help people that were not even getting any federal stimulus, like, right at the time when we were all getting those checks, from the federal government. Some folks did not get that, and so we actually surveyed them and found similar data points where 1 in 3 were skipping meals. We saw that 3 and 4 were reducing expenditures. I mean, they were changing what they were buying because they just didn't have that income, didn't have that money, didn't have the support. And so those were the strategies that people were employing then, and they're employing those now, right? Because now this is just a different crisis. This is a different sort of pressure that is actually removing some of their incomes there. One of the things that we did see is that people they did spend down, on their savings, but the thing that always gives me hope is that folks actually find ways of coming together and help with one another. That might mean that, they live in multiple families in one household. That's a way for them to, again, pool, resources so that they can stay housed, they can, make ends meet, or they basically share what they have with other people. They don't just hoard, their income to themselves, but they actually have a family or household, mentality to it. So they're weathering through. But I fear that, I mean, one crisis after another crisis after another crisis. I mean, people can only take so much, right? And then that is the big concern now, that as people face that food insecurity, as people again they diminish their consumption, or they change the quality of food that they buy. It's like they can only do that so long. So we definitely need to start thinking about what are the interventions that we need to employ now, because people are definitely feeling the pain, in the current crisis.
I completely agree with that, Jose, and we will have time to talk about some of those interventions. But I think that's such an important conversation because we're kind of going through compounding crises with COVID-19, which we're not fully out of yet, and now inflation and its impacts and the trade-offs that households are having to make. And with that, Jennifer, I want to turn it over to you. So I know before joining the NYC Economic Development Corporation, you were at the organization Asian Americans for Equality. So just kind of taking a step back to your role in the past, what were the top challenges faced by Asian American communities as it relates to these rising prices?
Yeah, thanks so much for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. I was struck by, on one hand, I think the two presentations of economic data, both the inclusion and also the omission of Asian Americans in some of the presentations. And, the need, I think, still to assert that Asian Americans are a part of BIPOC communities. And so I think it's important to put the challenges that Asian Americans in New York City that are facing in broader context of their experience of poverty and economic disadvantage in the city. In fact, almost 1 in 4 Asian New Yorkers lived in poverty in 2020, which is comparable to the share of Black and Latinx New Yorkers who live in poverty. And that's based on research from the Robin Hood, Foundation with Columbia University as a part of their annual poverty tracker. Their research has also found that Asian and Latinx immigrant seniors have the highest poverty rate of 30% of all immigrant seniors. And so with that in mind, I think consistent with some of the data that we saw around the consumption basket and sort of disparities amongst racial groups that Raji presented, I think it's notable that I think Asians and Black households spend more on housing. And so at the neighborhood level, in communities like Chinatown, Flushing, that have large populations of low-income Asian households, they're facing some real challenges in being able to afford housing. There's been rising rents, both in rent stabilized as well as unregulated housing in New York City. And with 24% of Asian immigrant New Yorkers living in overcrowded housing, they're extremely vulnerable to illegal rent hikes, to evictions, and community organizations that provide transitional housing to Asian families with children are seeing more than double the number of households who are seeking their assistance. And so that's sort of the hidden problem, in New York City, where Asian families, even though they're not showing up in the shelter population, they are seeking other forms of transitional housing in privately owned single family homes that have been illegally subdivided and are operated as hotels, or in hotels where they rent, on a nightly basis. We also saw that Asian households spend more on food, and so they're experiencing, food inflation in a very acute way. Organizations like AFI that serve Asian American communities in New York City that stood up emergency food pantry programs through the pandemic have had to continue those programs, even though the local government has been shrinking its role in coordinating access to food suppliers. And so AFI, for example, is continuing to serve almost 500 low-income Asian and senior households monthly by providing free Asian produce and pantry items in neighborhoods like Chinatown, the Lower East Side, and East Harlem. One last thing very quickly, I think is what I was surprised by was not seeing in the economic research the impact of utility costs and healthcare costs specifically on low-income households, because what we've seen through our organization is that Asian immigrant and I think other BIPOC communities are experiencing a lot of rising costs with respect to affording their utilities, prescription medicines, and having to make some difficult choices between paying for food, paying to keep their lights on, or being able to maintain preventative health care and prescription medicines, which really puts all of them at risk of having to rely on healthcare through emergency visits.
I think you brought up a really good point there, Jennifer, on housing. I think I want to kind of transition to the housing conversation. How can we talk about price increases without talking about the rental market, the housing market, home ownership? It's been front of line for the past couple years now. And Cassandra, your presentation, you said that fuel and rent prices have increased more than incomes over the past couple of years. There was also a recent Street Easy analysis that found that in New York, the disparity between rents and wage growth was at a 14-year high. So I want to open it up to the panel to see if there's anyone has insights on how inflation has affected the rental market. What is the impact of this on communities? And I guess the main question is, what are the trade-offs that families are having to make in order to afford these rental prices as well as other essential goods? Jennifer brought up a really good point of health and healthcare costs. That might be a trade-off that households are making. So yeah, I'll open it up to the panel for anyone who wants to jump in.
If I can share something, we did an analysis last year looking at how consumer protections were helping people when we compared folks that lived in California and Texas, and then we did an analysis of looking at just trying to analyze exactly the same type of person that lived in lived in California and Texas, and what we found was that people that we were serving were more likely to stay housed in California than they were in Texas. In fact, people in Texas were 4 times more likely to be evicted, during the pandemic because because they couldn't pay the rent. But in California, there were some consumer protection policies at the local level and the state level that would actually help people stay housed. And so while we saw rent going up, and then we see that, but it really is about the type of protections that are keeping people in place or in the same house. And so we saw in states where we have those strong policies, people were better off. And I sort of note that because as the pressures continue to increase with more rent, or even the price of housing goes up, to me it's like, well, what are the mechanisms that are there to help people weather those storms? And consumer protections policies at the state level are really critical to helping people.
I think something that I wanted to also just highlight is the relationship between, the rental market and the homeownership market and how that's being impacted by inflation. I mean, before the pandemic, I think it's very well understood that there was a significant disparity, between white homeownership and Black homeownership. And while I think homeownership for Latinx and Asian households was increasing before the pandemic, we really didn't see that same kind of trend amongst Black homeowners. And so that's only been exacerbated by the pandemic. And then now with rising interest rates, as more people who were looking to, as renters, become homeowners, with rising interest rates has obviously become more difficult. And so you have more renters staying in place. That's exacerbating the housing supply and making it even more unlikely for Black homeowners in particular to be able to access those opportunities. And then the structural inequalities that we saw that contributed to those disparities are only becoming worse. And so, factors like, higher rates of student debt, the higher rate of mortgage rate declines for Black prospective homeowners, continues to persist. And so, those factors around structural inequality are only going to be exacerbated, with both inflation and even, the Federal Reserve's, policies around trying to curb inflation. And so that's something that we really have to, I think, pay attention to, but also think of other ways to intervene to disrupt that trend.
Yeah, I really want to build on Jennifer's point here because part of the risk is that families of color are going into each economic shock with fewer resources available to them to buffer against those shocks. So part of the dynamic we're seeing over this summer is fewer supports through public benefits and other financial resources for families to cope with rising prices. And so we know that 32% of consumers across the country don't have enough savings available to be able to weather a $400 emergency. I think we're at the stage where people might be facing much larger financial emergencies than that. And when they're having to dip into savings, put things on their credit cards, sell off assets, it leaves them with fewer resources for the next economic shock, which I think is part of the concern is if we are looking to a possible economic downturn, or other possible like job shocks that families could experience in 2023 after having to weather inflation with fewer resources, families of color might be especially at risk of facing higher levels of financial hardship and food insecurity.
And if I can just jump in, I think a lot of important things have been said. And I do think that is one of the great concerns many communities have now is worrying about everyone's talking about, are we in a recession? Is a recession coming? And I think it's one thing about how people have been surviving through this inflationary period. With as a whole, the country's had pretty low unemployment rates for African Americans, pretty record low unemployment rates, though still almost twice that of whites, but historically 6% unemployment rate's quite high. The challenge, I think, we look back in the history of, what's been done to fight inflation in the past during the Volcker years, early 80s, and we saw, Black unemployment go from 11% to about 21% and not going back down to that 11% space for about, I don't know, 5 to 7 years or something to that effect. So I think, that is, I think, a great concern people have about what is the next shoe to drop, because as people has put forward, what we seem to maintain is deep racial economic inequality. Blacks have had 20 to 30% less home ownership rates than whites for the last 100 years. And even during good times, we, aren't seeing this addressed. So I think as we're fighting inflation, as we're trying to get out of a COVID recession, we have to make sure that racial economic inequality is dealt with as a serious crisis that isn't temporal, like we hope most of these other crises are.
Thanks for making that point, Dietrich. And I think this is a good segue into talking about businesses and labor and wages. So as we know, when the economy goes through hard times, quite often businesses of color, workers of color are the most affected and the first affected. So with that, maybe Dietrich, I'll ask you this first question. And I just want to pause here to address not a slang word, but a word that we've heard a little bit throughout this conversation, BIPOC. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color, just for everyone's awareness. So my question for you, Dietrich, is to what extent have BIPOC workers benefit from wage increases, and have these wage gains been eroded by inflation?
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting piece to look at. I haven't seen a racial breakdown of this article I'm about to mention in Bloomberg. Bloomberg did an article August 29th, which I thought was really interesting, highlighting that incomes among the bottom 50%, adjusted for inflation, increased by 1.3%. And so that actually low wage workers, according to this analysis, have managed to stay ahead of inflation. There wasn't a racial breakdown of that. But, I think, that is a great concern of mine, is that as we try to break out of inflation and probably raise unemployment, that we might actually put the most economically vulnerable in even a worse situation than they've been dealing with in dealing with these high levels of inflation. So I do think, and it has been I think a fairly unique period where we've seen some serious or substantial wage growth for low income workers, though it still hasn't gotten them to areas of economic sustainability, which is what we should all be advocating for.
And Jennifer, you might have some expertise on this. Have lower wage workers been able to access different or better job opportunities in the past couple of years?
Yeah, I think looking at some of the economic data, the results seem really mixed, I think, depending on the sector. So low-wage workers, at least in New York City, for example, and this might be probably reflective of national trends as well, are largely concentrated in certain industries like healthcare, food prep, personal care, and services. Looking at New York City data, for example, those particular industries account for less than 20% of the city's jobs, but account for a third of the city's current excess unemployment. And so there's been some movement where low-wage workers have been able to move, I think, into different types of industries. So you're seeing some shift, I think, from retail into wholesale trade, because of the surge in e-commerce, especially accelerated by the pandemic. There's been a lot more hiring and I think some strong wage growth in the wholesale trade. And so you are seeing low wage workers potentially, moving more into that particular industry. A question mark about how sustainable, that wage growth and sort of low unemployment might be. Whereas in other sectors like arts and hospitality, those to really continue to lag, in New York City at least, in the recovery of private sector jobs. And therefore, low wage workers in those particular industries have continued to struggle to be able to, find better quality jobs. I think overall, we're also seeing a trend where low wage workers are increasingly in part-time work rather than full-time work. And so that's potentially increasing their vulnerability. And so we're still seeing, I think, a persistence of women and young people who are remaining in low-wage jobs and in part-time work that is making it more difficult for them to be able to, benefit economically, from the overall recovery that the city and the country is experiencing.
And before we talk about policy responses, I wanted to ask about businesses. I don't think we can talk about labor and workers without talking about business owners and entrepreneurs who are also in the community. So I'm just going to open it up to the panel. If you have seen this, how have business owners, entrepreneurs, in addition to workers in your communities been affected by inflation?
And I'll just jump in to start off that, I think one thing that's important to remember is oftentimes we think of businesses, we think of a mom and pop store with a few employees, what have you, but recognizing that 80% of businesses have no employees. For African Americans, I think the last number I saw was like 96% of Black entrepreneurs have no employees. So I think it's not as a dramatic a difference between entrepreneurs and their response to COVID and what they've been dealing with versus the worker, because most entrepreneurs are workers, have some other job that they are doing, and at best might be, more using that as an income, as something to subsidize their income or strengthen their income versus it being their full-time thing with workers. But, and I'll let the other panelists speak more to this, but clearly with a economically fragile economic infrastructure, particularly for Blacks, Latinos, Indigenous people. We can see that economically fragile businesses are going to struggle the most to deal with these type of inflationary challenges and cost of goods, cost of service, these types of things.
I'll add to that by just saying that I think we can all agree that the inflation or the pandemic or other crises are negatively impacting people of color. I think we can all see that. Then the data shows that. I think what I would love for us to start talking about as a field is well, what are the solutions if we know for a fact that people that are most vulnerable are getting hit hardest. So so the data is showing that, and we see it in the people that we work with. We hear it in the stories that we collect, and even in our own research. So I think that's something that we can all sort of agree as a field, right? I think for small business owners within the immigrant community, one of the things that that I want to sort of put forth is that that some small businesses to them is sort of like that's like the only thing they can do, because they may not have the social security number or ITIN number, or they may not have sort of the legal standing to actually work or get that job, or even walk into the McDonald's or Burger King or whatever and get a job, right? They can't even get those jobs, so they have to create their own jobs. And that's what small business means in the immigrant context. They're creating their own source of income. So if that is the case, the question is like, well, how do you support that? How do you elevate that? How do you provide them structure so that they can, do that and do that well? I mean, in California, just this year, there was an effort of trying to formalize food street vendors. And thankfully there was an advocacy, that started in Los Angeles to make that, make street vendors legal. I mean, make them even just recognizable, or even have them apply for certification a lot easier. And so we had to, like, get a whole new law in place to make that happen. But that was a community driven process that that the governor signed into law. But now that strategy of how to create their own income is not being supported. And so this is what I talk about. But consumer protections. I mean, that is a consumer protection, sort of a vehicle to help them do better. And so I think we need to be more creative in our solutions of how to do it in a way that to support in how people are actually, finding ways to sustain themselves. And so here's one of those examples, and I'm sure that could, that's a story, for people all over the country. But seeing how small business ownership as a strategy for them creating their own income source, and then the question is like, well, how do we support them so that they can do that and do that really well?
Yeah, and I would add as a part of the solution, just very quickly, that there's an important role for community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, to continue to play as a part of this ecosystem. And I think it's been encouraging to see, and I think there's still an important role for CDFIs as mission-driven financial institutions that provide access to capital and technical assistance for, Black, immigrant, and women-owned businesses. For them, especially with rising interest rates, to continue to provide access to affordable capital and to different kinds of loan products for small businesses to start, to stabilize, and to grow through the economic recovery. We've seen, for example, at this small business CDFI that AFI has, called Renaissance CDC. During these inflationary times, CDFIs like Renaissance have played an important role of providing working capital to small businesses, who are facing obviously rising costs in inputs, and have had to make tough choices about how to continue to keep their prices low for their consumers while bearing sort of those higher costs. And so, yeah, just really wanted to highlight that, the Treasury Department and the CDFI network do have important roles to play in this overall ecosystem.
Agreed. And Jennifer, I want to build on that, on your point. So, how is the Economic Development Corporation responding to challenges faced by low-income communities and businesses in New York City?
Yeah, as the economic development organization for the city, our focus is more on sort of medium or longer term solutions through investing in neighborhoods, through redeveloping specific assets, and better connecting low income communities to employment centers across the city, as well as investing in capacity building for MWBE firms, and providing access to capital, especially growth capital. So specifically, a couple of examples. EDC back in 2016 had launched an MWBE program specifically to connect small and mid-sized construction firms to EDC's capital project pipeline. And more recently, in September, EDC expanded that program to really connect small and medium, Black and women-owned construction firms to the growing pipeline of construction jobs in the green economy, as the city's really doubling down on decarbonization in the fight for climate change. And what that means specifically is in programs like Construct NYC, we're connecting firms to opportunities to participate in up to $4 billion of green retrofit projects that will be happening in the next decade, in buildings for city agencies. And then more recently, last week, as an example of how the city is really investing in creating space, as well as bringing together partnerships between like CUNY, the city, and state governments to really create career pathways. We're really doubling down on investments in the life science and public health sector. And so part of what we're doing is creating a campus that brings together CUNY, DOE, the city and state to create life science space to really help further support life science startups and growing firms who are developing new technologies and medical therapies, but also connecting them with a high school to really continue to increase and create a diverse talent pipeline in New York City for lower income students to be able to have access to higher quality jobs. And then there are other programs where we try to connect startup founders to venture capital and to peer networks to really support and create a more inclusive sort of tech ecosystem in New York City.
And if I could just highlight, I think, I think we also need some bold federal policies as well to address, entrepreneurship. And, a couple of policies I don't think people think enough about is one, something that would be helpful for workers and the self-employed is universal health care. I mean, healthcare is such a challenge for most Americans, but particularly for those trying to start a small business or run their own business. Another thing that, I think we had the opportunity to do was to maintain unemployment benefits for the self-employed. It's really important that entrepreneurs, particularly those from financially unstable communities, have some type of safety net as they're trying to develop their business. So those are just two kind of big, bold federal policies that I think also are important tools to address these issues.
That is a great point, Diedrich. And Jose, you've mentioned multiple times that we need creative solutions, policy solutions. And I think what really struck me earlier is what you said about, especially about households who were excluded from federal stimulus, how 1 in 3 are skipping meals, reducing expenditures. That's something that is really challenging to households. So my question to you is, as families and communities are recovering from both COVID and are trying to grapple with inflation and price increases, what are the solutions from your perspective that can help them bear the burden? And what are some financial security tools that can help Latinx communities weather inflation in particular?
Yeah, I have an urgency to try to get us to the solution conversations as a field, not just right now, but because all these problems, they impact, they're known. We know them, we feel them, we see them. We have engaged with them, for years, right? And so this is not news. And so I think as we push ourselves to think about, well, what are the solutions, then we can think of, well, what is relevant for the different communities, and how can we show up for them, both from the federal level, from the private level to the state level as well, right? And so, because we all need to be creative in how we approach. Now, for the immigrant community specifically, one of the things that we've seen that has transformed people's financial livelihoods practically overnight was just having legal acknowledgement of their essence, of their presence. I mean, with when people get DACA, when they're documented, when they have, or even when people go from a legal permanent resident to citizenship, we basically see them being able to, have the bargaining, power to, ask for more wages, and so their incomes go up just by improving their sort of legal status in that sense. So that is the one thing we need: immigration reform. We need a pathway to, citizenship, so that people as workers, as participants in our economy, can actually, claim their space and be recognized for that. So that is a one thing. Second is more, we definitely need to expand access to the social safety net. I mean, there's a lot of fear, within the immigrant community of even accessing, the services that they may be even eligible for, because they fear that getting that access might count against them when they actually do try to regularize their immigration status. So that's something that is really, it's painful to see, particularly when they actually may be eligible for it. But then that begs the question, like, well, why is it our, social safety is so confusing that we don't even know what we're eligible for, because you live in this zip code or that zip code, or you're in this particular person or that person. Is like, and it's sort of very confusing. So we need to do a better job simplifying eligibility, or making even the user experience. Imagine that, making the user experience better, for poor people. And so there's a lot of things that we need to do as a society. Again, from the public policy realm to more in the way that we even construct programs. And now let me end with this one story real quick, because there was a story of how at the state level, I mean, here in California, we were trying to do the right thing, but we did it in such a way that it made things even worse. And that is, the state developed this application to try to help renters, stay housed by giving them rental assistance. But the application was so onerous, so long. It was only in English at the beginning that people just never even, sought it out. And so the state had to like revamp it, redo it. And but then the time that it took them to do that, it depressed the enrollment period. And so, so those are the examples of like how can we do better, in even delivering the services, and there's a lot that we can learn from what we've experienced, throughout the pandemic. So there's a lot to do, and I want to express the urgency of it, because the impact is real, and people are going hungry, people are losing their homes, people are losing their jobs, and then they're just trying to even just trying to survive. So we need to do better than that.
Yeah, I
I would
really,
also, oh,
sorry.
I was gonna quickly add, I think just, thinking about sort of the two key categories of spending that households are really sort of feeling the inflation impact on: transportation and housing. So just thinking about programs in New York City, for example, that are very intentionally providing discounted subway fares, ferry ride fares to low-income households, senior households, I think are really important, and potentially examples of what other cities should look at, replicating or adapting. And the continual role that the federal government has, I think, to invest and encourage more cities to do transit-oriented development, do integrated transit planning and economic development planning in a way that really brings especially low-income workers closer to jobs, because they're spending too much of their limited income on transportation costs. And then, the housing supply, obviously, a deep-seated problem, but I think one that continues to require a lot of focus and resources for addressing longstanding, segregation in housing policy. In New York City, we're seeing that there's an acute housing shortage because there just not hasn't been enough housing supply or construction, not only in New York City, but across the region. And I think there's an increasing need for housing solutions that are happening more at the regional level. That really kind of gets to the fact that there are still legacy discriminatory housing policies like restrictive zoning in municipalities that's really limiting the opportunity to create higher density affordable housing.
Thanks, Jennifer. And yeah, I want to open it up to the rest of the panel because, like Jose said, the impact is very, very real and the need is very urgent. So how can policy address the impact of inflation on communities of color? And who are the stakeholders, the institutions that can help? And Cassandra, I'll start with you.
Thank you. So I described this earlier in the presentation, but food insecurity is really this canary in a coal mine that indicates that folks are really having acute financial hardship and can't meet their food needs. And we often see food budgets are the first thing that are cut in tough economic times. So while families are experiencing that, we really need to strengthen the buffers that they have to weather these shocks. And SNAP is often the first defense against food insecurity, is it incredibly responsive to economic conditions. So right now, we only adjust SNAP benefits for inflation once a year. So they'll be adjusted in October to account for inflation. But this change will be several months too late for families who have experienced hardship all summer. So adjusting these benefits twice a year during periods of high inflation can create more timely support for families, because that timing is very important to make sure that families can meet their needs. It's also important to consider that for many families who participate on SNAP, the maximum SNAP benefit did not cover their food needs in 21% of US counties in both rural and urban areas in 2021. So as prices increase, fewer families will be able to meet their food needs with existing supports, and efforts to increase the SNAP benefits amounts can be really helpful. We found that the increase in SNAP benefits from the reevaluated Thrifty Food Plan kept nearly 2.3 million people out of poverty in the last quarter of 2021 and reduced poverty by approximately 4.7%. And the poverty reduction for this benefit expansion in SNAP was highest for Black and Hispanic families and helped reduce disparities between these groups and white families. So these increased emergency allotments are going to end with the public health emergency. So if we lose this powerful tool to reduce poverty and hardship for families of color, especially during a time when families are increasingly needing it the most, we should consider if inflation itself provides sufficient rationale to extend benefits and extend the emergency allotment so families can continue meeting their needs. But that is also a very partial solution, right? It's like helping families get through to the next time when things are more stable. And so addressing the root causes of financial resilience are going to require much more, like investing in supports that allow families to build wealth, more robust safety net policies, improving job quality, having robust policies against displacement due to, rising costs of housing. And all of those are really important to make sure that we're not always putting into place stopgap measures that are really partial but don't address those underlying disparities in resources that families have that allow them to buffer against economic shocks.
I want to echo Cassandra's concerns there. I think it's going to take a whole bunch of immediate stopgap measures as well as big, vision changing types of measures. I was reading this weekend a piece by Doug Henwood in the Jacobin, Yes, You Should Worry About Inflation. And I thought it did a really good job of going pretty much into detail about the competing tensions of trying to keep inflation low to help working class people, but also making sure that we're keeping unemployment low. And actually, we need to get unemployment lower, for particularly communities of color that face much higher unemployment rates than whites. And I've talked about a few bold policies. There's a lot more that can be discussed. I'm sure some of the other panelists will put forward. But I think we also should be mixing in and make sure we don't forget the private commitments that had come out over the last couple years around racial equity post the George Floyd murder. I know we at NCRC have been doing community benefit agreements with financial institutions across the country. And how can we, I think, similar to government policies, corporate policies, how can we have clear quantitative metrics about not just saying we are investing in racial economic equity, but what are you actually doing? What is the increase needed? Or what is the increase you're going to advance? We did a paper, 60% 60% home ownership, Black home ownership is a radical Black wealth building goal. We did analysis that we have to increase Black home ownership by about 50% and maintain that for 20 years just to get African Americans at a 60% home ownership rate. That's not equal with whites, which is at 73%, but just getting substantive Black home ownership. And I think similarly, you could do calculations for Latinos, for Native Americans, and Asian Americans have less of a home ownership rate than white Americans. So I do think we need to understand the scope of the problem and then figure out through federal policy, state policy, private corporations, how we can coordinate and engage and be serious about not just saying racial economic equity, but actually doing things that push metrics that bridge it. Because I do get concerned a little bit. I'm glad everyone's talking about the racial wealth divide and racial economic inequality, but talking about it doesn't bridge it. And so I want to make sure that we're actually taking substantive steps to advance it.
Thank you, Diedrich. I think this really brings our conversation and discussion to an end. I wanted to thank all of the panelists for giving such insightful thoughts. I think we heard some really good insights today. What I heard was the importance of social safety nets, making sure that access to them is as inclusive as possible, especially for communities that are on the margin. long-term investments in neighborhoods, connecting people to employment. And last but not least, this is not only a federal issue, but private sector has a strong role, especially when it comes to racial equity and inclusion for all. So with that, I just want to thank all of the panelists again. And I invite you all to continue sharing your thoughts and engaging with the New York Fed. And we will be doing closing remarks. So you can go ahead and turn off your cameras. And I invite David Erickson to give us our closing remarks for the day.
Thanks, Devon, and thanks to everyone. Wow, that was really an invigorating conversation. And I have a lot of things to sort of to share here as we close. One is to Raji and her Equitable Growth research team, the economists here at the New York Fed. There are armies of statisticians and economists looking at data around employment, labor participation, industrial production, even some on consumption like the Consumer Price Index. But there are no data that really that break down how inflation is experienced differently by different groups. And Raji's team has really been, I mean, this is a real breakthrough that they've been able to sort of use some proxy variables, make some assumptions, but look at different baskets of goods, but really take a sharper lens on how inflation is being experienced by different groups. And we can't thank them enough for doing that and for being so creative, because it's really important that we understand how these this changing experience is affecting people differently. And then, of course, the panel really brought that to life. And so I really want to thank Jennifer, Jose, Diedrich, and Cassandra for their insights and really doing two things at once, right? Helping us get a little bit deeper under the numbers in a way that's really helpful. I thought, for example, Jennifer sort of raising the fact that even though in some of those estimates, it looked as though Asian Americans fared reasonably well in the recent period, that 1 in 4 Asian Americans living in New York City are experiencing poverty, which is about the same rate as Black and Latinx people in this city. So that's getting a more nuanced understanding, getting under the numbers. Cassandra is really using food insecurity as a slightly more honed a tool to see where the canary in the coal mine, as she says, to really see where the stress points were for families. And then I think, Jose really pushing us to say, we know some of this stuff isn't new. Like we know we have a slightly better understanding of it, but the solutions are many, and we need to get to work on them. And they run the spectrum, and all the panelists, I think, touched on, many aspects of those, whether it's changes in government policy at all levels, participation from the private sector, but a number of ways in which we can sort of focus on solutions and really think about how we can help alleviate some of these issues that we're raising here. I want to thank Devon Bodie for what a great, not only she organized this event, but she did such a fantastic job moderating. And so what a engaging and disarming person. We're just so lucky to have her on our staff. And finally, I want to thank someone who's no longer with us. Actually, she's been promoted to a very big job here at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Marissa Casillas Barnes, who is now the assistant corporate secretary here. But she was the one who really founded this series that is a partnership with between the Community Development Department and the Economic Research Group. We're really proud of this series because it really does, in that old phrase, sort of brings Greece to Rome. And so we really want to keep that conversation going, because we always think that getting a deeper understanding of the problem is always absolutely essential, but really focusing on solutions is essential too. And so that's what this series is all about. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you for taking your time to be with us today. And we look forward to meeting up again at the next conversation. So take care, everyone.